In this first part of Lecture 1 of Unit 3, we're going to review the tracts that you've already learned, with emphasis on where they are located within the brainstem. We're also going to review some terminology that is important to understand within the brainstem. The midbrain is also known as the mesencephalon. We're going to be learning about a nucleus associated with a cranial nerve called the mesencephalic nucleus. Hearing that name, it will let you know that it is located inside the midbrain. The hindbrain is a name you may come across during your article search and your research for your presentation. The hindbrain is made up of the pons and the medulla oblongata. I am not going to ask you to know that, but I mention it in case you see it while reading the literature. Here we can see a picture of the brainstem along with the brain, but the focus here being the brainstem. So at the most rostral or most superior part of the brainstem, we have the midbrain or the mesencephalon. Below that we have the pons. Now this image is, I think, misleading because it shows the pons in two different colors, making it appear that, particularly the way they label it, that only the front part is the pons. But the pons runs all the way to the back towards that cerebellum. So here it's shown in both green and blue. Inferior or caudal to the pons, we have the medulla oblongata. And then inferior to that, we have the spinal cord. This image also shows some of the arteries that we will be talking about in Unit 4. Looking at position relative to each other, we have the brainstem broken up into different regions. The basal portion is the anterior portion. So if we talk about the basilar pons, we're talking about the anterior most portion of the pons. This was colored blue in the previous picture. It's the egg-shaped region, the kind of big bulbous region on the ventral aspect of the pons. But the anterior medulla is also known as the basal region. The tegmentum is behind that. So the more dorsal or posterior aspects of the medulla and the pons, for the pons that was colored green in the previous picture, that is known as the tegmentum. In the midbrain, this is the middle portion of the midbrain. And then in only the midbrain, we have another section called the tectum. The most posterior or most dorsal aspect of the midbrain is the tectum. So in the medulla and the pons, we have basal medulla, basal pons. We have the tegmentum of the medulla and the pons. In the midbrain, we have the tegmentum and we have the tectum. The most anterior aspect of the midbrain has a special name. So we don't generally refer to it as the basal midbrain, although if you were to read that, you should recognize that basal is the most ventral portion. Here we can see then the different sections of the brainstem. So we have the basilar pons here, that egg-shaped structure, and if we continue to go down into the medulla, that would be the basilar medulla. Then we have the tegmentum, making up the bulk of the part of the brainstem that is kind of continuous with the spinal cord. And then we have the tectum of the midbrain being the most posterior aspect. And here's another view of the three parts of the brainstem. Starting with figure A here, we have the medulla. The pink parts in all of these would be the basilar part. So we have the anterior basilar part of the medulla in pink. It's got a couple of structures there that you will be needing to know. Then we have in the pons the big egg-shaped part in the front. That's the basal pons. There'll be structures in there you'll also be asked to know. And then for the midbrain in figure C, the basilar part in pink you can see has a special name called the cerebral peduncle, and I'm going to want you to know that. Then in green we have the tegmentum. So you can see that the medulla is roughly split in two parts, with the basilar part and the tegmentum. The pons has a much bigger basilar portion than it does a tegmentum, but maybe 1/3 and 2/3. And then the cerebral peduncle, we can see, has a small basilar portion in the front, a very large tegmentum, and then a small tectum in the rear. Your brainstem contains ascending sensory tracts, descending motor tracts, several nuclei that are important for basic life, and the cranial nerve nuclei for the majority of our cranial nerves. In general, when looking at cranial nerves next week, keep in mind that the sensory nuclei tend to be lateral to the motor nuclei. Reviewing the tracts that you're already familiar with, we have the spinothalamic tract. In some sources, once it's in the brainstem, they will call it a spinal lemniscus. So if you see that in any of your articles, recognize it's really the same thing and just call it the spinothalamic tract. We'll keep it simple. The medial lemniscus you're familiar with. That's carrying our second order neurons for our conscious proprioception and discriminative touch. And we find that the nuclei associated with the second order neurons containing their somas, their cell bodies, are located in the more posterior, inferior aspect of the medulla. So very close to the spinomedullary junction, where the spinal cord and the medulla come together. In the back part of that medulla, we have these nuclei. The axons then cross midline to enter the medial lemniscus, which is located anterior in the medulla. So the nuclei are posterior, the neurons course anteriorly, and they cross midline as they do so. And then the medial lemniscus ascends anteriorly. It is quite medial located on either side of midline, which is why it's called the medial lemniscus. Then we have the posterior spinocerebellar tracts and the cuneo-cerebellar tracts. These are only going to be found in the medulla, whereas the others, the spinothalamic tract for pain and temperature and the medial lemniscus for discriminative touch and conscious proprioception, travel throughout the brainstem, getting up to the brain. Our posterior spinocerebellar and cuneo-cerebellar tracts are heading their information to the cerebellum. So they are only found in the medulla because at the junction of the pons and medulla, we have the bridge or gateway to the cerebellum, if you will, for these tracts, the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And here's an image to remind us as to where these different tracts are located. So we have coming up in red, I have our unconscious proprioception. We have coming up from the spinal cord, axons in the posterior spinocerebellar tract. It gets up to that junction of the pons and the medulla where it enters the inferior cerebellar peduncle to head over to the ipsilateral cerebellum. The shorter one we can see has a cell body here in a nucleus that in the inferior or caudal aspect of the medulla, and those axons then travel in the cuneo-cerebellar tract also to enter the inferior cerebellar peduncle to get to the ipsilateral half of the cerebellum. In blue, we have our second order neurons for discriminative touch and conscious proprioception. Again, we can see that the nucleus is in the caudal medulla, and then those neurons cross midline and ascend, you can see quite midline, quite medially, just to the side of midline, and ascend up through the remainder of the brainstem. Note that they do start to move a little bit lateral. They're still medial within the pons, but once we get into the midbrain, particularly the more rostral midbrain, they are positioned a bit more lateral. And then we have our spinothalamic tract in green, carrying pain and temperature information, crude touch information. This particular tract is lateral in the spinal cord, and it remains lateral all the way through the brainstem. And then we have our descending motor tracts. We have some that you're familiar with and some that are new. The one that I've asked you to be able to draw out and to know in detail is our lateral corticospinal tract. When we are in the brainstem, the anterior corticospinal tract and lateral corticospinal tract are traveling together. So you'll see them just called corticospinal tracts. They're also known as the pyramidal tracts because on the anterior aspect of the medulla, in the basilar portion of the medulla, there are two bulges on either side of midline. And these bulges are known as the medullary pyramids. And since these particular tracts travel down through the pyramids, they are known as the pyramidal tracts. In the midbrain, the pyramidal tracts are coming down from the brain into the brainstem through the cerebral peduncles. So they're going to be situated on the anterior aspect, the basilar aspect of our midbrain, known as the cerebral peduncles. Like the cerebellar peduncles, you can think of these as what the connector between the brainstem and another structure. So they're connecting the brain to the brainstem. Again, it's the most ventral part. And in there with these pyramidal tracts, we're also going to find some additional tracts. One set of tracts are called the cortical bulbar tracts. Another are corticopontine fibers. We will be talking about corticopontine fibers when we talk about the cerebellum and its functioning. We will talk about corticobulbar when we talk about cranial nerves next week. Essentially, the corticobulbar tracts are analogous to the lateral corticospinal tracts. The difference is that instead of innervating lower motor neurons to the spinal nerves, they're innervating lower motor neurons to the cranial nerves. The bulb is the old word for medulla. Apparently, anatomists thought the medulla looked kind of like a flower bulb, and that is why it's called corticobulbar. These tracts remain anterior throughout the brainstem, so they come down in the cerebral peduncles and the ventral aspect of the midbrain. They travel in the basal pons, so the ventral aspect of the pons, and then those medullary pyramids are the most ventral aspect of the medulla. The lateral corticospinal tract axons then decussate or cross at the spinomedullary junction in what is known as the pyramidal decussations. So again, decussate simply means to cross. So far, all of our sensory tracts that we talked about, with the exception of unconscious proprioception, also decussated. But we don't refer to a particular structure as a decussation. But here, that decussation is quite localized at this spinomedullary junction. So it is known as the pyramidal decussation. Here we can see a picture of the ventral inferior aspect of the brain and the brainstem. We're not going to talk about the very top of the picture where you see the optic nerve and optic chiasm shown until next week. But I do want you to see the cerebral peduncle. So you can see it coming on either side there. And you can see how it angles kind of outwards, making almost a V shape with the one on the right and the one on the left. And that's why when I drew the medial lemniscus, we saw that as it got to the midbrain, it started to veer laterally because it needs to go through those cerebral, actually posterior to those cerebral peduncles, but all of the neurons that are traveling to the brain kind of have to go around the thalamus, so they move a bit laterally. Then we have the pons. You can see the big egg-shaped part of the pons. You can see the large middle cerebral peduncle that we haven't talked about yet, connecting the pons to the cerebellum. Again, we'll talk about that much more when we talk about the cerebellum. Not readily seen on this image, right where the pons and the medulla come together would be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then you can see maybe about half or 2/3 of the medulla itself. On either side of midline, so there's a groove down the middle. On either side of that, you see a bump, and those would be the medullary pyramids. There's a pyramid on each side. And then lateral to that, there's another bump called the olive, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the different life nuclei, as well as when we talk about the cerebellum. just to talk a little bit more about the corticobulbar tracts, because they are not exactly the same as the lateral corticospinal tract, although quite similar. Your book refers to these as cortical brainstem tracts because they go to the pons as well as going down to the medulla. And since the medulla is the bulb, some people feel that cortical brainstem is a more appropriate name. But I think in most places yet, we still see it listed as corticobulbar. These are the upper motor neurons innervating voluntary lower motor neurons in the cranial nerves. There are different upper motor neurons innervating the lower motor neurons going to the extraocular muscles. We're not going to go into those particular upper motor neurons because it's a lot more complicated system. So moving your eyes around is actually rather complex system, and I don't believe that we need to go there. So we're not going to talk about the majority of control of voluntary movement of the eyes. We're going to talk about just one little part of that. So when you're thinking corticobulbar, you have to leave out the cranial nerves that are going to the extraocular muscles. But for the remaining cranial nerves that are innervating skeletal muscle, our corticobulbar tracts are going to contain the upper motor neurons that are going to innervate the voluntary lower motor neurons. Something that makes these tracts unique is that unlike the lateral corticospinal tract, which only innervates contralaterally, the corticobulbar tracts innervate bilaterally. There is one exception and one significant almost exception. That is the nerves, the lower motor neurons that are going to innervate the muscles of facial expression on the lower half of your face are only controlled contralaterally. I don't know the reason why, but for whatever reason, the muscles of facial expression that essentially move your mouth, your platysma around your neck, the nasalis and muscles around your nose, those particular muscles are, their lower motor neurons only receive corticobulbar innervation contralaterally, just like the muscles of your arms and legs only get contralateral innervation. But the muscles that are around your eyes, such as closing your eyelids, wrinkling your forehead, pulling your eyebrows together. So again, muscles of facial expression, not the muscles that move your eyes, but the muscles of the skin around your eyes, excuse me, those receive bilateral upper motor neuron innervation just as the rest of the cranial nerves do. It makes sense to have bilateral innervation in this area because so much of this our life depends on. We need to have control of the muscles around our throat and in order to survive. So if there's an injury on one side, God gave us a backup on the other side. But for some reason, he did not give us this backup for the muscles of facial expression on the lower face. The other, what I'm going to consider to be an exception, is the hypoglossal nerve going to your tongue. While there is likely to be some bilateral upper motor neuron innervation to the lower motor neurons of the hypoglossal nerve to your tongue, in most individuals, it's a very dominant contralateral control, which means that if I have a damage to the corticobulbar tract going to the hypoglossal nerve on the right side of my brain or brainstem, I'm going to end up with paresis on the left side of my tongue because there's not enough ipsilateral control to prevent the weakness. In some people, it's totally contralateral. In most people, it's a very asymmetrical control. So for the tongue, I just want you to think if there's damage on one side of the corticobulbar tract coming down from the cortex, going down to the medulla, I want you to be thinking that the tongue is going to have paresis, as well as the lower half of the muscles of facial expression. Everything else, we will not see paresis or paralysis because we have equal control from both sides. The corticobulbar tracts travel with the lateral corticospinal tracts in the cerebral peduncles. And your book has a picture of the cerebral peduncles and a listing of where the lateral cortical spinal tracts are compared to the cortical bulbar tracts, compared to the cortical pontine. Cortical pontine are neurons coming from the cortex heading down to the pons. And there are lots of different functions for those, but again, we'll talk about those more related to the cerebellum. Another difference between cortical bulbar tracts and lateral cortical spinal tracts is that the cortical bulbar tracts do not have a single point of decussation. They're more like our ascending tracts for pain and temperature, where whatever level they enter the spinal cord, they start to cross. Here, what's going to happen is wherever the motor nuclei are of the cranial nerves that they need to innervate, they're going to start to cross. So they don't cross at one spot and then travel down the brainstem on the other side. Instead, they cross when they get to the level of where the nucleus is that they need to innervate. Just a reminder that starting in our brainstem, in the medulla or in the pons, we have the reticulospinal tracts and the vestibulospinal tracts. So injuries that occur to the brainstem can affect those tracts as well. And then we have a picture here showing our cortical bulbar tracts. What I tried to do is show just a couple of nuclei, cranial nerve nuclei. They're not any specific nucleus, but just how these neurons innervate bilaterally. So coming down from the right side of the brain in red, we have cortical bulbar neurons. They get to where the nucleus is located, and then some innervate the nucleus ipsilaterally, but some cross over to go to the contralateral nucleus. And you can see the blue neurons, which are in the cortical bulbar tract from the left hemisphere, are doing exactly the same thing. Other neurons need to innervate nuclei further down in the brainstem, so they keep going, and they cross when they get to the level of those nuclei. So again, there's not one point where they all cross. They cross when they get to the level of the nucleus that they're going to innervate. So that's the end of our review of the tracts that involved in the spinal cord that you already know. We've added now our cortical bulbar tracts, and we've added a couple more terms that you can put into your glossary.